Well, welcome to this lecture on resistance identities. My name is Kees de Lauw. In this lecture I'll discuss the formation of resistance identities. Identities are used in many different ways to resist changes. They are used to resist urbanization, resist migration, they are used to resist gas exploitation, and they are used, for instance, to oppose municipal amalgamation. Well, how are resistance identities formed? They are formed to oppose changes. As I discussed in a previous lecture, normative evaluations of change are always an important aspect of spatial identity discourses. I also discussed that spatial identity discourses are also on the relation of a specific entity across different scales. And when there are changes, these can affect also these different scale levels. For instance, changes can occur in the characteristic elements which constitute a region. Through social change, through migration for instance, or de-institutionalisation, the characteristics of the region can change. But these changes can also be related to changes in relation with the neighbors, through the creation of new forms of infrastructure, to new forms of regional cooperation, or even through amalgamation, municipal amalgamation with neighboring municipalities for instance. These can result in the creation of resistance identity discourses. But also changes in relation to higher scales can be important. National or European disintegration can be opposed. So there are many different types of identity discourses. Not only very positive identity discourses focus on development, but also negatively there are many identity discourses which fear the loss of identity. And these are the core of resistance identity discourses. Well, there's also the question of form and function. There are different types of identity discourses. Some are more hopeful, others are more negative, like the resistance identity discourses. And their political use is of course then very different, but also the character of these discourses are very different. Resistance identity discourses are much more thicker than other types of identity discourses. I discussed this distinction between thick and thin identities in the previous lecture, and here I'll show you just once again the classification of the main differences between those identity discourses. To better understand why identities thicken, we can refer to two great sociologists. First of all, Zygmunt Bauman. His main point is that we are now entering a phase of liquid modernity, and that changeable modernity that undermines established identities, which then paradoxically become more important politically. People want to resist those changes, and then they focus on their identity, which is then one of the bases why resistance identities are formed. Then there's Menno Castells. In one of his great books, The Power of Identity, he discusses three types of identities. First of all, legitimizing identities. These are identities which are linked to government and to legitimize policies like naturalism, or in the past ideas about welfare state. Then there are project identities. These are more progressive identities linked to new social movements, for instance. But most importantly in this frame, in this lecture, are his discussion of resistance identities. He coined more or less that phrase. And those resistance identities, these are formed, according to Menno Castells, in response to devaluation and stigmatization. When groups feel that changes in society, when those changes threaten their way of life, they can develop what he then calls resistance identities. And he discusses this in quite detail for the fundamentalisms, religious fundamentalisms of Islam and Christian fundamentalism. This concept of resistance identities is also used by geographers. For instance, and especially by Anssi Pasing and Kai Zimmerbauer. They analyzed how identities were used to oppose the amalgamation of three municipalities in Finland, especially in the old municipality of Nurmu. The people rallied against that amalgamation because they argued that their identity was too much different from the main Sanyenko community in that region. While the link to formation of resistance identities in that instance of municipal amalgamation, they linked it to a more general idea about how identities are used in the general creation and institutionalizations of regions. They referred to an older model developed by Antipasi a couple of decades ago, which distinguishes between four different aspects which are important in the formation and the institutionalization of regions. Those are the territorial shape, conceptual shape, the institutional shape, and the established role. Let's take a closer look at them and how these together form the process of the institutionalization of a region. Well, let's take a closer look at the process of regional institutionalization. Well, first of all, there's the territorial shape that consists of the borders and how these were formed over time through political processes, but also territorial shape is about the landscape. It refers to the physical aspects of a region. And that is linked to the symbolic shape, how people look at their region, and how people from the outside look at their region, how they, what they consider to be the identity of that region. And that is linked to the institutional shape, which institutionalizes that identity through, for instance, media or education, but also it stabilizes the border through, for instance, having its own administration. And thirdly, there's the established role. That is about the established relation of a region in its larger surroundings. For instance, a region which has a lot of industries, exports a lot to other regions in the country, and then it has a strong established outside role. And these four aspects are closely interrelated and reinforce each other. And over time, we see that that process of regional institutionalization reinforces itself, and that creates ever stronger regions. But sometimes it's not an instance of institutionalization of a region, but a region can also become de-institutionalized. For instance, the established role of a region can become threatened through, for instance, globalization or deindustrialization. The role of an industrial region in its wider surroundings can diminish. But also institutionally, it can be threatened, it can deinstitutionalize. For instance, through amalgamation, then it loses its own administration. But also through regionalization, the growing importance of regional forms of cooperation, for instance, municipalities, can lose a lot of their institutional autonomy. And also through Brussels, for instance, nations. This scheme can also be used to look at the institutionalization of nations, also through the Europeanization of politics and the increasing regulation from the European Union. The institutional shape of a region or state or nation state can be challenged. And that then leaves a region or a nation with just its symbolic shape and its territorial shape, which then strengthen each other, and this is the basis of the emergence of resistance identities. So the deinstitutionalization of a region or a nation state can result in the formation of resistance identity discourses, which very much focus on their own identities and link that to the territorial shape and to the historical formation of that historical shape. So it's a kind of reversal of institutionalization, which transforms existing identity discourses, which used to be very much linked also to the established role, for instance, of a region. They're used to bridging differences, and it's reduced to an inward-looking, thickened resistance identity discourse, which very much focus on bonding the population within a threatened space together. Resistance identity discourses can also be linked to the classification I made between thick and thin identity elements in spatial identity discourses. We see that when resistance identity discourses emerge, there's a process going on from a thickening of identity discourses, meaning that the thin aspects of identity discourse become less important, while the thick aspects of spatial identity discourses become more important. They become more closed, fixed on the territory, very much focused on strong institutions, strong government, very much focused on the population within the boundaries, and very much linked to culture, very much focused on historical aspects and of the defense of traditions, and very much focused against globalization, very much focused on the local and national scale level. Well, in reality, there are of course many differences of the formation of resistance identities. For instance, the Brexit campaign really transformed the UK identity discourse into a resistance identity discourse, at least the opponents of Brussels and those people in favor of Brexit, they transformed the identity discourse of Britain into very much a resistance identity discourse, and they were very successful in it. You can use that classification of thick and thin identities and look what you see if you can apply it to the speech Boris Johnson made at the end of the Brexit campaign. Another example which relates to the formation of resistance identities is what happened in India after partition. The creation of a border really transformed the identities of communities who were very used to live side by side for centuries. Please take a look at this very horrific documentary about the origins and the consequences of the division of India. The formation of resistance identities is, however, not limited to places far away or in the distant past. Also here in the Netherlands, resistance identities emerge during the process of municipal amalgamations. I studied that and I made some publications about it. You see them here. That formation of resistance identities in the Netherlands has not resulted in violence, and these studies also show that there are processes in place through which one can overcome the negative consequences of those resistance identities. I'll come back to that in a later lecture.